is Monday, March 2nd, 2020. This is your good friend Debbie Levitt from Delta CX, and you are joining us for another super fun podcast, this time on product managers and UX. And this one came from a question I got in our Slack channel from someone who said they liked reading my book, thank you, but that I didn't really go into enough detail about the relationship between product managers and UX. And of course, as my book is the length of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, I did have to eventually stop writing, but you're right, that was left out. So we have two fantastic guests today who are going to give us their opinions on product management and UX and how we can make the universe a better place. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves as always, and we're going to start with our new friend, Jonathan Toler, who we all met during my Concentric conference. If you haven't seen that, go into the YouTube channel at deltacx.tv and check out his presentation on transforming the steel industry with prototyping and personas. Jonathan.
Yeah, hi. I'm Jonathan Toler. I head up our product and our innovation group here at Klockner. Klockner is an $8 billion metal distributor who's undergone a nice, what we call a digital transformation path. It's been a very fun journey to been on for the last 3 years. But historically, I've worked for various real estate startups such as owners.com. I worked at Auto Trader, been at Macy's.com, been around the block here at Cox Enterprises as well. And so we're looking forward to having this conversation. Always been in kind of that product management function. And of course, over the last, let's say 15 years, really evolved from being a developer to a business analyst to a product manager. And now, of course, been leading product teams for the last 5 to 7 years.
It sounds like quite accidentally we all have Macy's.com in common. Do you two know each other?
It's a big company, so I don't think so.
Okay.
I was actually out of the Atlanta office, which is a little more backbone infrastructure stuff as opposed to the front end.
Okay, well then I'm going to let Cameron Craig introduce himself. He's dialed in. So Cam, tell us about your world. How do we know you?
So, hi, I'm Cameron. I head up the product and UX groups at the Albertsons companies, which is the combination of Safeway and Albertsons across the United States. Previous to that, much like you, Debbie, and you, Jonathan, I was at Macy's. So that's where Debbie and I met. And previous to that, I was doing industrial design and consulting design for a number of clients, the Gates Foundation, large banks, large institutions, various ballets and symphonies, so kind of all over the map. And like you guys, I've had background varied, but product has always been a large part of what I've done. So now I'm managing both those things here.
Well, good. Then it sounds like both of you will hopefully have some ideas for our audience on where the boundaries are or should be. And I'll just remind everybody that if you're joining us live on LinkedIn or YouTube, we are taking questions and comments live. So please join right in. So let me start with Jonathan. Jonathan, can you tell me a little bit about where you see the boundaries of what product managers should be doing and what UX should be doing and where you feel kind of, there's those boundaries?
Sure. So, at least for us, when it comes to let's say building the personas and really doing that upfront research, right? I love to I'd say push it off onto UX, but I really like to say like our product folks should be really figuring out kind of the business kind of problems and let's say from a process standpoint, documenting the process. While our UX folks are kind of taking it to that next level of really understanding the why. And really trying to put people, of course, into the groups and really trying to look for patterns, let's say patterns of how people work. That's kind of like the nice split, right? Because a lot of our UX folks, at least here at Clock, they don't understand the business, so to speak, or they don't really necessarily have deep business knowledge. But what they do have is they have really nice, of course, interaction knowledge. So they understand how to put together interaction. They understand how people are segmented together. And so really we love to lean on our product folks for their business, their understanding of the business and understanding of really how to apply technology, while the UX folks are can live in this almost utopian world of here's how it should be, without any limitations. So
All right, Cam, you're welcome to agree, disagree, have another angle of this. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that largely. I think where from the basic human aspect, human to human, so product person to UX person, I think where it's always worked best is where collaboration exists and you let those players play their roles and their expertise comes out and everybody relies on that given expertise. I think, you know, like Jonathan had just said, sometimes with the UX person, you end up trying to get to utopia. And oftentimes with product people, they're like, I need this in a week. So you're pretty far from utopia. But if you can get them to collaborate together and kind of see one another's point of view and also focus on the things that are important to both groups because they both bring that in, you get a stronger product and most of the time you get something that actually meets customer need, which I think is the thing that, we're all striving for in our own ways. And I think sometimes the way those things get expressed from the UX point of view or the product point of view isn't always totally aligned, but if you can have those groups collaborating and kind of working from the same set of objectives, you get a better end result.
Let me also throw this one at you guys individually. So I find that sometimes where product and UX go wrong is that while we want that collaboration, it doesn't seem to start early enough. And by the time product is coming to UX with something that's on the roadmap or a project we're finally spinning up, it's a surprise to UX and, oh my God, get going. And how fast can you have this done? Can you have wireframes in 2 days? In your opinions, and I'll ask you separately, how early should UX and product be collaborating? How far back in the process of either looking at the portfolio or program or epics, how far back should it go where we should be talking to each other? Jonathan?
Sure. So, in a perfect world, I think you have this idea where me as someone in product and someone in UX could say, hey, look, I'm thinking about this idea. Let's ideate together, right? And a lot of times you're ideating on ideas on things that may never happen, or they're things that, let's say, aren't necessarily, you're speculating so much, right? And that is, I think, the golden experience where you can have really a great experience, right? Everyone feels like they're involved, and you're building something, and maybe you're even building something together so that you can go sell it to somebody else, right? For an executive or something like that. I think that's one side of it, right? I think that's great, but the earlier the better. But I think what really people don't realize sometimes, and I say folks, is like really it's the product in the UX world. It's really saying sometimes you as a product manager, right? You walk into a stakeholder meeting, or you walk into a customer meeting, and something pops out, and you got to go, right? I think that's always going to happen, right? And I think the key is as long as you're having continuous conversations as to what the direction of the product is, right? What are you doing, right? It shouldn't just be hey, you see me only when I need something, right? But the idea of we call you kind of this term big turnaround. Yeah, that's going to happen. But if you as a product professional and you as a UX professional haven't been talking about what is your product, what's the what is the roadmap, what are you trying to build, right? That's a continuous conversation that should be happening, whether it's weekly or daily or whatever, right? Hopefully you're all sitting together or you're collaborating, but you can have those conversations very, very frequently. I think that helps keeping everyone on the same page. But understanding, let's say, what is the exact feature that's going to be built, right? What's the exact screen or whatever that short-term thing is, it's going to happen, right? But if everything that gets kind of approached as a big formal, like, oh, we haven't talked in a few months and I need this now, right? You're not going to be successful, right? I think that's essentially what we're getting at. But, yeah, it'd be great if we could all ideate on every feature together on the roadmap. But I just, unfortunately, there's resource constraints, right? And that's not possible, but it would be the best way to go.
And I don't know if it's my internet or
That's
Jonathan's.
the way you got to start, and making sure that everyone's,
I think your Cam, is it my internet or his? I feel like he's blipping a little bit, just for people listening to the archive later.
It's blipping on my end too.
Okay, so just a warning, Jonathan, your audio's blipping a little bit. So I'm going to throw it over to Cam. Cam, how far back into the dinosaur age should product and UX be working together?
Well, again, I mean, it's hard to disagree with anything Jonathan said. I think maybe I'm going to say something a little bit cheeky. It kind of depends on who owns the roadmap, right? And I'm not necessarily saying product or UX. It's who is the person putting elements on the roadmap. And if that group or that governing body is product and UX, collaboration is probably happening from the very first idea inception, right? Because as you're looking at the life cycle of any product, you're thinking about probably one of a few things. Okay, this is new and next, or this is some kind of performance improvement, or this is continuous improvement. And if the teams are collaborating and working together, they're each playing a role, and chances are what's happening is UX is doing some research and they're figuring out what customers are saying, and they're understanding what's working, what's got friction, where the opportunities are. And they're going back to product and saying, hey, as we're thinking about the next step in the roadmap, here's where we should be going, right? Now, granted, all that needs to be vetted. Is there an actual customer need there? And from a technology end and an expense end, can you afford to do those changes or make those switches? Do you have to sell that outside of the organization? And ultimately, at least in the world of retail, there's a lot of, is this going to generate revenue or a sale for us? And can we generate that revenue or sale profitably? Which, again, product is obviously going to be better positioned to understand some aspects of that. But I guess for us, where it's worked best is we've taken that life cycle apart to some degree, and we're saying, much the way Jonathan said, when you're in production, there's a lot of first this, then that, and that's an easy role to define, I think, to some degree, because you're saying, hey, we've committed to this, here's the spec, here's the scope, now I need this designed. Both the UX side of it and the product side, I think, have a really good grasp of that. I think where we've broken more ground, both at Macy's and to some degree here, is when you think about all the things that lead up to a business decision of putting something on the actual roadmap and what that life cycle is, how do those teams then play together? And that, I think in the beginning, felt a little territorial to some degree. It's like, you guys aren't putting anything on the roadmap without me as a product person. It's like, well, wait a minute, we're not doing that. We're suggesting that there are certain things that we could do to make this better. Let's evaluate those things given the criteria that you've given us. Like, can it be done properly? Can it be done on a rational timeline? And do we think there's a hope that it's going to generate revenue or make sales? I think if you look at it that way, that top of funnel, if you will, collaboration and involvement of the teams happens. But I think that's a more uncomfortable place for a lot of organizations. You'll even hear me saying, we, they, to some degree, where there really isn't a we, they anymore. It's all, rises up to me. I'm the guy. So whether I've got the UX guy hat on or the product guy hat on, it's really us as a group. And that, I think, you're hearing me even have struggles keeping that, kind of us, them thing from happening.
So we've talked a little bit about some slightly perfect worlds where product and UX are collaborating early. They're working together to put things on the roadmap. They're working together to do early research to make sure there's customer value in some of the ideas they're looking at pursuing. They might do a little bit of ideation early on to see where something could go. These sound like somewhat perfect worlds, but based on where we've all worked, no names named.
Yeah, I was going to say, you worked at Macy's. Like, that was far from a perfect world. I certainly don't think the world that I'm in today is anywhere. Yeah, right. Like, I got to tell you, girl, like, I'm not in a perfect environment by any stretch of the imagination. It's still a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Like, there's nothing idealized about this. I'm still living in dystopia.
I'm so sorry to hear that. I wanted better for you. But so let's talk about those imperfect worlds, because that's where we're all living. And I can certainly say that in some of the experiences I had many times where a product manager came to me and said, hey, here's the next project. And we really don't have time for research. So, let's just go with a couple of things that we have or some data that we've sliced out and just wireframe me something. And it sounds to me like, well, holy cats, you've come to me extremely too late. This is a bit of a surprise. And then we're all scrambling to do what we can. I'm nowhere near doing my best work, but I'm doing what I can. What, let's talk about, I'll give each of you a chance, of course, some of the realities of some of those product managers who either from poor planning or surprise changes, all of a sudden, no time for research, get designing. I'll start with Cam. What do we do? What should I do?
Yeah, I mean, well, if we're talking about collision avoidance, I would say the best way of doing that is having a really well-defined process and a really defined life cycle. And I mean, again, like I was talking about, we break those life cycles down into, design and discovery, and then the back half of it is like a go-to-market strategy. And honestly, in a go-to-market strategy, if the product and UX people largely aren't on a cadence of release and prepping whatever they need for release and doing that together, they're probably getting fired. But on the other end of it, without that process, you do get a ton of that. And you're always going to have some level of executive mandate where somebody drops in and they're like, hey, by the way, team, this has to happen. And, that kind of rises up. It's like, as a leader of that group, if I'm not willing to make those hard choices, then a product person or a UX person is probably going to end up suffering in that. But we've eliminated a lot of what you described, where the product person is largely like, hey, sorry, requirement number 57B slipped out of the deck and you didn't see it. Largely by having kind of a tight process that we can enforce to some degree, which all that sounds kind of negative, but I think to some degree, without guardrails, you end up in that chaos, and then you're spending a bunch of time undoing that chaos.
And nothing wrong with having a proper process that everybody's on board with. Jonathan, your thoughts on what happens when UX gets surprised and someone's trying to greatly reduce the time they have to do something?
Yeah, sure. And apologies on the internet connectivity too. I'm not quite sure what's going on. Yeah, so essentially, as Cameron said before, right, process is important, and a lot of it's also the work we put in beforehand, right? So we've just building, building templates, kind of building guidelines, between really saying, here are kind of how we interact, let's say from a, from a pixel standpoint, right? Kind of having that, that brand book of here's kind of some things that we already kind of know how certain things are going to go. So we've kind of described, some of that, I guess you say the nitpicky stuff is something that we've tried to eliminate in the front hand. And then there's this idea, of course, since everyone is part of the kind of the agile team, is that you kind of understand when something comes through, is it some, what is the expectation, right? Is the expectation that this is going to go out next week? Well, if that's the expectation, right, then we know that, guess what, the requirements that the product folks are writing are going to be pretty lean too. So, we're all on this boat together, right? And the developers are going to know that, hey, man, what we're going to give to you is going to be light, right? So move fast. And so, I think because we're all sharing the same outcome, then a lot of times, it's like, man, this kind of sucks, but you know what, you go with it, right? And what really doesn't work well is, hey, you know what, we have 3 months to work on this, but I'm only going to give you, and I say this is the us and them thing, right? Around you on UX, I'm only going to give you a week to work on this because, even though we got a lot of time to develop it, right? That generally doesn't work well. But if it's something that's deadline based, right? Everyone understands that, right? It's part of being part of the team, and this idea of you and UX being separate, right? No, you've got to be all part of the same team, right? If you're all part of the same team, then you have the same expectations for delivery, and then you gotta move a little bit faster, right? And part of that idea of building the wireframes and building the mocks or the comps really fast, well, you realize things are going to get missed. Or you also have to have a dev team that's going to be willing to be more flexible, a little more agile. I think that kind of helps as well, from an expectation standpoint.
Speaking of agile, what advice can you guys give? I know that based on the proper definition of agility, we're supposed to be gathering customer feedback, and we're supposed to be feeding that back into the system so that we can determine if the current product or features or roadmap are going in the wrong direction and we need to change course, because why would we keep building something nobody wants? Do you guys have any particular recommendations or things that you like to see your teams doing with respect to gathering that feedback and getting it back into the system, especially over to engineering, who sometimes releases stuff and really doesn't know how it ends up until poop hits fans? Jonathan, anything you want to say on that one?
Yeah, the most successful teams I've been a part of had, someone in UX that was actually part of the Agile team.
Yes, please.
So while they make a solid line to the director of user experience or whatever it is, right? But they're part of the Agile team, and and they're dotted line into whoever's leading that Agile team as well. So that's the most successful thing I've seen.
Me too.
But with one thing to think about is that sometimes when that person is a member of that Agile team, that long-term research or that long-term view, sometimes gets lost. So it's a little bit of making sure that you're part of the Agile team, that you're doing all the, you're embedded, right? You're getting that short-term feedback without forgetting about that long-term, what's the benefit? The UX is a long-term, that's a role that helps you in the long term, right? It's not, you have to be forward thinking. So I think that's the way I like it. So.
Cameron, how do we feed good feedback back into especially the engineering team so that stuff isn't sitting in the backlog forever?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you guys are both hitting on things that I think are table stakes. It doesn't really work without embedded teams. It doesn't really work without the UX and product being hand in hand, hopefully working together daily. I think the thing that I'm really beginning to realize is there's a whole suite of tools as well around this that, felt like a luxury, certainly even 3 years ago at Macy's, in terms of behavioral analytics and path tracking and all those things. But in a high frequency, high volume business like retail, and certainly if you're a larger retailer, and even, a lot of the other high frequency interaction sites or apps that people use, like there's so much rich data, and it's also really hard for any one human to argue against those things again. And sometimes, sadly, a lot of this stuff comes down to defensible concepts. It's like, okay, so what are we actually seeing? I can usability test something, or I can focus group test something, or I can put stuff up on usertesting.com, all totally rational data points. But I think where we have had the most success, and honestly, it's smoothed out a lot of things on the back end when you actually put something into market, is if you have these tools that allow you to monitor the experience and take action quickly, you're not guessing at what it is that you think you have to fix. And it also doesn't get into necessarily finger pointing or somebody didn't do their job, or, hey, this could have been designed better, or, hey, this could have, the interaction could have been thought through better. None of those things really matter when you're able to kind of look at the data and follow that to what the actual problem is. And it also has kind of motivated people to fix the problem because they realize it's an actual problem. Oftentimes, in the past, it felt like we were trying to educate people as to what the problem actually is. And then there was a lot of interpretation, and you get technology involved again. And there's issues there as well, where you're sort of saying like, well, is it the performance of the technology or is it the design? With this, it's really given us the ability to kind of pinpoint what we think the problems are. And it's taken away a lot of the, sort of human error, human nature stuff, where it's more about people's feelings than it is about actually solving the problem. So I think as we see that get introduced more and more into mainstream business environments, you'll see hopefully less and less of that kind of argument. And, right now it's a continuing process of continuing to invest in those things and also convince management after a year of having those things in place, in our instance, of, the inherent value. I mean, it saved us a bunch of time internally around trying to dog down or track down the issues. Our technology team, I think, utterly buys into it. It's just really kind of baking that cost in and figuring out whether or not the tool itself can pay for the sort of downtime that we all have is we're not designing or we're not re-engineering certain things because we're busy talking about how they should be re-engineered or what could possibly be the problem, right? So there's a lot less of that I think cost-wise we're trying to bake in.
Great. Thanks. Guys, we're live. I know these people are doing a great job answering these questions. The live listeners may not have any questions, but if you do, please ask them. I'm monitoring both LinkedIn and YouTube. Of course, this will be available on the YouTube archive afterward. Episode, what are we up to? 22 of the podcast. So I have endless questions here. So I want to ask you guys, certainly I've been in situations where a product manager has come to me and said, just make what's in the requirements. Or the product manager loves to do a little wireframing. They got their hands on Sketch or Balsamic or Acture, and they say, yeah, we have this thing we're going to be making, and I think it could look like this. And obviously that can lead to conflict because it starts to feel not as much like collaboration, at least to me, and a little bit more like, now we're peeing on each other's territory. And so what is a good way to handle that? And kind of where do we draw the line between collaboration and design by committee? Jonathan, unless you want to pass.
No, it's a good question. So, it's very interesting. I like, innovative thinking product managers in terms of, if you have ideas, sometimes you're driven by a vision or you saw something cool. It is something that's tough to kind of hand over your baby, right? When it becomes not just your idea, but everyone's idea, right? And I think that's just something that, if it requires a significant amount of interfaces, right? If it requires there's a certain level of complexity to it. You as a product manager kind of have to, understand when you have to take a step back. Well, I think on the UX side too is really understanding if someone has a certain vision, right, or a certain, bias to how maybe something looks or something works, right? I really think it's also having that deep conversation about understanding why is it that you feel this way, or show me the example that was your inspiration. I think it's a little bit of a two-way street, right? But if it's something that you came up with, out of the blue, or you want to, you're trying to sell it to someone, or you really think that you've in your heart, you really think that you're going to make a huge difference. I think it's you're gonna have a little bit of ownership of it, but I think on the UX side you got to kind of work from there and kind of really understand kind of the intent behind it and kind of work together on there, because there is going to be a little bit of crossover, but it's all about people, man, right? You gotta really understand what people's motivations are and kind of work from there.
All right, Cam, give me your angle there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep mine shorter. I think with us and with me over the last year, the thing has been own the outcome, and actually be incented on owning the outcome. I think, you can endlessly talk about why something should look or behave or act or whatever. And UX people are always going to have a very refined sense of how that is. And oftentimes product people aren't going to really understand that because they're driven by different things. And sometimes, as Jonathan said, really smart and clever product people will recommend something that's rational. You can't look at it and say like, no, there's no way that we should design this. And vice versa. There's oftentimes where, I've walked by conference rooms where the user experience is literally the group that is managing the user experience is like at the whiteboard talking about the flow of traffic, how many people, what that means to the business. And it is getting blurrier, right? Like we're actually taking a lot of those core role definers to some degree with both those groups, and it is getting blurry. And yeah, you still have the occasional where people are in your office yelling about, yet again, I'm getting hand-drawn things on the back of a napkin or this piece of binder paper that has a coffee stain on it. And yeah, that doesn't feel good. I mean, I'm not going to deny in either way, right? Like if the product person that morning opens up our Confluence instance and sees 16 new requirements written by UX that are prioritized and kind of in the immediate backlog, there's going to be some kind of backlash, the same way when you get the napkin with the coffee stain on it. But if they can own the outcome, they start to worry a little less about the ingredients that get them to the outcome, but recognize that you're either going to be rewarded on that outcome or the questions will come from senior management if the outcome isn't there. And it tends to, I think, maybe depersonalize some of those lower level things. Like they're in it together to win it, you know. And again, not every team works this way, but if we're talking about where the success lies, at least from the groups that I've been managing, the most successful teams have that in their DNA to some degree. They're not stressing out necessarily about the day-to-day. They're literally like, is this the best outcome for the customer and the business?
And many of my experiences, cough, 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 I found that when something goes well, it's been, oh, thank you, product managers, for prioritizing those features and having a great roadmap. Thank you, engineering, for building something that was mostly not buggy. Thank you, marketing, for making sure people knew about it. Thank you, sales, for selling it. And seen. And I find that UX is very often kind of left out of that we're still seen a bit as the pair of hands that sketched what the product manager or the business owner, or the business analyst kind of, put in the requirements. I'll start with Cam. What do you think UX can do, or UX in relationship with other roles, to make sure that executives and leaders and other people hold everyone accountable and reward everyone when it goes well?
Well, so this is going to seem really cheesy, but Friday we launched a giant thing, and the first award handed out was to the UX team.
Gold stars!
Which is pretty great. Yeah, to be the first one up there to grab the award. But I mean, more seriously, to your point, I think a lot of this is still the evolving role of UX and to some degree product, right? Like product, there are some circles within our company where the business, right? These other people who run the P&Ls and are actually thinking about the larger customer experience outside of digital, which is deemed super important, are still like, well, I have no idea what product does. And I don't know why I'm, they're in the middle between me and all these developers and designers getting things done. So long-winded way of saying, I think we have a long way to go still in the world of like mainstream business to explain what these practices are and what they do, and to some degree where their value is. I think we're beginning to see that more and more. But at the same time, I think, it's like the world of advertising 100 years ago. You were they marketers? Were they creatives? What were they? And that's, kind of settled in and has changed and evolved. But I think that we're in that place now where we're, call it 25, 30 years on, with these roles that exist to do things digitally. And that's finally beginning to sink in. And you're seeing that in the world of work as well, where the way the roles are structured are all kind of beginning to take the same form, how we talk about them. The fact that, we have chief customer officers, on the board of directors of companies now, where we never did. And I think you probably, in digital companies, you'll begin to probably see, more. I mean, you're already seeing chief product, but you probably will start to see chief experience officer that is a UX person potentially.
Yes.
And then the last thing I think that I would add is, there's a little bit of like design changes the world, which is now being taught in business schools, where I don't think even 15 years ago that was really a concept. And I think people are really waking up to the fact that all of this, the design isn't an afterthought. The design is the foundation. Like without a solid design to any of these things, they don't really exist. And I think that's something that was hidden much more in hardware and other, products that involved industrial design. Those things were an ingredient, and I think people paid a lot more attention to the object. But because the experience that we're designing, the experience itself is the product, oftentimes like untangling that to some degree and like recognizing like, hey, without the design, this thing doesn't actually exist. Is really the thing that I'm trying to get the people around me, the laterals, to kind of understand.
Thank you. Thank you, as always, for your fine shepherding. Jonathan, I'll throw it over to you. What can we do to help UX be a little better understood or find that seat at the table a little bit more rather than being treated as the grunt worker?
Sure. So, one of the things that when we actually go and visit customers, for example, really, it's our product team, of course, who are kind of pushing that, but essentially we always go with somebody from UX if possible, right? And so really it's saying, look, how do I expose, both my customer or the stakeholder to the UX team so that the UX who's on our UX team is actually hearing first, right? That feedback, but they're also able to ask their own questions, right? Not a filtered question. So really, it's kind of saying, how do you bring that forward? The same thing goes from if let's say we're running, A/B tests through Optimizely, or we've done some other research, right? Let's make sure that whoever's running that, the UX department, actually is publishing those findings on their own, right? It's not being pushed through through product or through data analytics, right? It's really saying, hey, look, here is, let's establish who are the experts as to, beyond just design. That's something that we've been kind of focusing on, and our UX team here Klockner actually goes out on their own sometimes and talks to customers and really publishes their findings, on Yammer, on their own, right? So that they kind of stand on their own. So while they're embedded in the agile teams, right, everyone kind of is getting a clear understanding as to what UX does, and really kind of, they're being an asset when it comes to really kind of research, like customer research, right, beyond kind of what our marketing team does, right? And so I think really is giving that exposure is something that's really important. And it's also the idea that UX can fight for that access to to the customers, to whoever decision makers are, and that decision makers understand that if you have a question about a customer, or you have a question about how something works, or the other great thing is when it comes to if you create your cool looking comps, or people, at least in my organization, love seeing what things could look like, that it's both the product and the UX folks together that are presenting that, right? And so that the UX person knows, is like, hey, look, we made it look this way, and having them, making sure that UX is in the room, right? It's, I hate to use the word lean in, right? I think it's maybe overused sometimes. And he's either leaning in or making sure that everyone understands that it's a partnership, right? And bringing things to decision makers or to the influencers together, right? And that makes it also easier too, because when someone asks a question as to, hey, why is that green versus blue? A product guy is like, I don't know, right? Because we have executives that will ask that question, right? They care about button color, right? I'm like, hey, let's talk to the UX guy, right? Because and then that kind of helps, the UX person can kind of defend or kind of talk about, color schemes and things like that. So it's like I said, exposure, right? Bringing them forward. I think that will help with that experience.
And it's always, I can't help but think that this is something that just requires managerial intervention, because sometimes when I'm doing my Tuesday office hours, Ask Me Anything, I get people who are talking about their work experiences and they're going, my job doesn't get this about what I do. They don't let me do research. They don't understand this. How do I convince them? And I sometimes feel like if that's falling to you, that's going to be really tough. It's really tough to take someone who doesn't respect you and magically explode into getting them to respect you. So how what can UX managers do to help kind of, I hate saying evangelize. You guys know I hate the whole evangelism thing, but what can we do to help inform and really excite other departments about what UX can do? Like, I like to tell engineering, we're going to save you time, money, and sanity, because how often would you like to rebuild that or fix it later? So what do you guys suggest? I'll start with Jonathan. Do you guys have any tips or tricks that you use when you're trying to deal with other departments to get them a little bit more excited about giving UX the time and budget they need?
You know what? It's really funny. It's have been more along the lines of, here's, there's been a little bit of a fear of building the wrong thing, right? So here's how we help ensure that we're not going to build the wrong thing, that we're making the right investments. So a lot of times that is kind of baked into our project plan, is saying, look, this is a big deal. Let's not screw it up, right? Here's how we make sure, here's kind of a good CYA, right, to help you make this. And if we bring UX in, then it's a little bit of a CYA that way. And then the other side too is kind of, you find is like, I found it the more proactive, right? So if you're in UX, right, and you see a bad email that goes out, right, and people kind of, at least in our organization, really notice when bad emails go out. It's like, hey, look, here's how we could have fixed this, or here's some different concepts that we've been proactively thinking about to kind of improve X, right? And then, at the end of the day, you got to just you got to evangelize yourself. You got to sell yourself, right? And I think that's, or sell your group, right? And then, that's kind of starts there. It's, if you, whether it's looking at industry trends, right, it's all about communication, letting people know that you're there, right? Because, like, you're right, you can fall into the background sometimes, and UX is very easy to fall into the background sometimes because just of how certain organizations are built out, right? But I think it's being proactive, right? And it's the same speech for people who are in the database team, right? Or on the data analytics, right? It's all about really, hey, here's the value that I'm creating, right? And here's how this value applies to the investments that we're making, right? Here's how this value applies to what you, Mr. Executive, are trying to get accomplished, right? I think, being proactive with those communications and being front and center, I think help, because then as new projects come along, right, it becomes something that you kind of gets baked into the budget. I think it gets kind of baked into, what makes projects that we do successful from a PMO's perspective or whatever. So.
Thanks. Yeah. Cam, any thoughts from you? Anything, any tools, any techniques, any catchphrases that you have when trying to explain to other leaders or departments that UX proactively predicts and mitigates risk, or something else?
Well, first and foremost, I think Jonathan and I need to collaborate on a T-shirt that we can sell and hand out that says UX is my CYA.
I love it.
I love it too. I mean, I'm thinking embroidered sweatshirts and maybe license plates. Because I think that's right? Like, that's where the journey begins. And I think a lot of the things that Jonathan called out are those building blocks to get that value creation seen. I think what I've spent a fair amount of time doing, right or wrong, and I think probably wrong at Macy's, and I'll own my failures. There is, I spent a lot of time trying to manage up and to some degree selling a higher concept, if you will, of what design changing the world means. And here, I think I spent a lot more time trying to figure out how we measure that value, right? So to actually say the value added is this, right? Like, a lot of the things, Debbie, that you called out, and Jonathan, that you called out, are the anecdotal, kind of the what and whys. But I wanted to get down to how we actually can measure that and then quantify that value, right? Because without that, anybody outside of a product organization, again, business, they have a really hard time understanding that, right? And there's no amount of time and energy that you can put into educating that's going to get them to see that. They just don't come from that world. They spend their time, moving numbers around in a spreadsheet, or sitting in front of slideware, which is oftentimes not designed. So it's getting out of that world and maybe kind of trying to speak their language a little bit more and saying, like, hey, I get it. Here's the time saved quantifiably, for your dev team. Here's the time saved in outages when we don't do this. Here's the time saved in rework. And the great thing is, because we have so many projects going on in these areas, one of the things that I would also recommend is run some of them in this idealized way and then go to your dystopian past and let those things play out and compare those, because I think that's where the biggest impact has come for me, is like, okay, well, look, when we get the teams together and they're working collaboratively, we do research and we kind of play by the process, the outcome, and like literally this, why we got this award was for exactly that. It's like the smoothest release they've had in more than 18 months with the fewest amount of fail points. And, the things things now alive and out in the world since Monday. And, the grand total of emergency phone calls and emergency late night meetings I've been on where we didn't think something through on behalf of the customer is an absolute zero, which never happens. Yeah. So again, how expensive is it to wake up 100 people, get them on the phone at 4 a.m. to fix something that a customer has essentially QA'd for you? And you look stupid. I mean, I can't say anything, when the customer's like, hey, you idiots, and a lot of that stuff can be thought through, discovered and figured out, with some time and effort up front, but you're saving that time and energy on the back end. And oftentimes you're avoiding Band-Aids in the system and you're avoiding Band-Aids in code by not rolling things in and out after they've been launched. And there's real value there.
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan's UX's CYA is the quote of the year. Jonathan, get that on Zazzle or something. But
I'm buying that shirt all day long.
Yeah, what I usually say is UX testing is the QA of UX. Like, yes, you wouldn't send your code out without running appropriate testing on it. Why do we send out concepts or ideas or architecture or designs without having done that testing? And as you're saying, we don't want the customer to end up the guinea pig there. I also made a couple of notes while you were talking, Cameron, that one thing that I mentioned in my book is that I find that a lot of teams, I believe, are going in the wrong direction, because instead of focusing on finding ways to quantify UX, even though what we do can be very qualitative, finding ways to quantify it, instead, I'm hearing a lot of, let's just create empathy. And I guess everybody bought a set of crystals or I don't know what, but I find that you can't get stakeholders into a room and create empathy. Either they've got empathy or they don't. And if they had empathy, then when we say, hey, customers are struggling with this thing, they would go, sweet holy Lord, let's get you some budget and time. But that never happens. And that's why it's got to be sold, or we've got to speak their language, or however people say it, because really they just want to hear the numbers. What are we spending, or what could we spend? What could we save? Time, money, whatever it is. And that's why I think we have to focus more on those metrics. And I'm also calling for, tell me what you think of this. I believe, I want to know what you guys think, that a lot of what goes wrong at companies with some of these projects is the budget only seems to be calculated up to when the product gets released. And then when the product starts going all funky and customer support is on fire and we're getting the feedback that things aren't quite right and we're starting to figure out what went wrong, and then engineering's going to have to fix it, magically that's never added to the old budget. Somehow that just seems to get absorbed by whatever project we're in now, because we're just going to have to pause these user stories or pause this sprint or whatever. And I wish that everybody would take all of those people and all of that time and all of those meetings and add it back to the old budget and go, sweet holy Lord, we were so over budget because we effed it up and we rushed this thing out. And guess what? That cost us more than we thought. But I feel like when it gets hidden in these future budgets, nobody is seeing the failure as clearly as they could. Gentlemen, thoughts on that? Someone unmute.
Yeah, I mean, hard to disagree with that. Like, I think everything you said is spot on. I think, again, if you have leadership that's willing to expose the failure, right? And oftentimes that's a difficulty, and it's easy to hide those things in a future roadmap, like you said. We're trying to go the other way. Like, I think that the thing that we've realized as a product and UX team is, hey, there's a capacity and a cost for doing business. Exactly like you said, Debbie, when things go out, it doesn't mean that that's free money found, right? If you're changing anything that isn't now part of your roadmap, that means you're shortening the capacity to achieve new things and to do new things. And if you're not willing as a leader who's managing the roadmap to call that out specifically, then you're just kind of sucking it up. And what tends to happen is you close the books for the year and you look at what was delivered and we're far short. And then it's excuse making as to why, when in all reality, it's like, well, we didn't plan for the eventual, care and feeding of this thing that we put out into the world. So without doing that up front, I think, you're naturally in a place where at some point you have to do that reckoning. Like somebody's going to come along to say, why did we not deliver these other things we said we were going to deliver? Like, you guys are so slow. And it's like, well, we're not. We're actually still maintaining and managing the things that we built, you know, in the first quarter of the year.
Yeah, we're covering some Band-Aids on stuff.
Yep.
Sadly.
Yep.
Jonathan, something to add to that?
You know what? No, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Cameron kind of hit the nail on the head. I think one of the issues we, at least that I see as well, it's really saying, having that expectation up front and saying, what are we, from a feature standpoint, have we covered what we want to do within this MVP or, within this release? But it's also, really having that tough conversation with engineering, which is something that we kind of had to learn here at Clockner, is saying, look, sometimes I need you to make it fast, and sometimes I need you to make it scalable, right? And what does it really take for us to scale this up, right? And I'm going to do my best to give you an example of, what's our total addressable market, how many customers do I think I'm going to be able to onboard really quickly. But that's something that we actually struggle with, is really the scalability issue, right? And that took a little bit of better, we realized we had to plan better on our side. It's really how do we scale up, right? When we scale up, what's actually doable, both from a technology perspective, from a operations perspective, right? And these are all things, of course, that would go into planning, right? And essentially, you're really talking about how well are you planning, and lessons learned, right? It's it's not just technology, it's not just product, it's not just pixels. Sometimes you got to make sure that the folks behind the scenes can actually deal with things too as well, and that's a nice lesson learned that we had as well. So.
Great. So I know we've got a few minutes left, so we'll start wrapping up. So give you guys each some last words, and then I'll do a little housekeeping at the end. It's not house cleaning, right? I don't want to clean my house. Jonathan, let me start with you. Any final words, any points you were hoping to make that we didn't get to? Anything to add?
No, yeah, I think having that, like I said, having product and UX together, right? As Cameron said, showing quantifiable, impact, I think is huge, right? Regardless of what you're doing. I think that's something that's it's really great. It's a really great takeaway, I think, for me as well, is to always try to look for that quantifiable benefit for everything that our product and our innovation teams are doing. So, this has been a great experience. So thank you for letting me talk with you guys, and really looking forward to, of course, hearing more on the channel as well. But thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming back, Jonathan. And everybody catch his other recording in the YouTube archive under Concentric 2020. You'll find him there. Cameron, last words from the you.
From the me, I would say, it's love one another and love the outcome. I'm gonna be saying UX is my CYA all day today, maybe all day, every day. I think it's getting the teams to work together. That's kind of the main thing, and then it's getting out and having leadership that actually cares and wants to change the way in which both practice areas are seen in the org, because they do wield a lot of power. I think it's just kind of making sure that everybody understands what it is that they're here to do. Yeah, that's kind of it. I also, Debbie and Jonathan, appreciate the time to hang out with you guys. It's nice to know that I'm not alone. That feels good too. I'm saying that with empathy.
Exactly.
And maybe a crystal.
Alone.
Yeah, I'm not alone.
You're not. So thank you again, both of you. So great to have both of you here for this. Thank you to our friend in Slack, and I'm sorry I forgot your name, who originally requested this podcast. So if you guys ask me for topics, I find people and I do them. Last week's podcast on planning UX research and testing was also a request. So some quick notes. I am doing a live stream almost every weekday this month. It is way too much for me to even put into the LinkedIn event system system, which stinks and was clearly made by interns. So please go to deltacx.com, go to events, go to live stream podcasts, and just look at the goofy Google Calendar. Every Tuesday is Office Hours Ask Me Anything. I answer any questions about UX, CX, careers, problems, struggles. This Wednesday, we're premiering a new live podcast. We're doing UX speed dating for those looking for jobs. I will interview up to 12 people for 4 minutes each, and hopefully hiring managers will see this and fall in love with some of those people and want to interview them. Thursday's podcast will be guest Brett Moraldo. We'll be talking about the science of UX. And we are doing basically 4 live streams a week for the rest of the month. So please check the Google Calendar because I can't keep up with the LinkedIn calendar and it doesn't push it to you in any way. Also, please subscribe on YouTube. I'm not monetizing this. We're not sponsored. It's just so that you can know when we're live. Please subscribe on YouTube. You can find the channel at deltacx.tv. And of course, if you're curious at all about my book, please find Delta CX on Amazon. Thanks again to Jonathan and Cameron. Please find them on the LinkedIn. Jonathan Toler is spelled JONATHAN TOLER, and Cameron is spelled CAM as in Mary, ERON as in Nancy. Craig, CRAIG, and that's because this also goes out as a podcast without video and people can't see your names. And with that, I will stop the stream. Thanks again to everybody. Have a super week.